What if I told you that while the world was focused on tanks and battlefields, there was another war happening in the shadows of World War II? A secret conflict where the weapons weren't bullets and bombs, but brushes and marble sculptures. A war where victory meant controlling the cultural soul of an entire continent. I'm Jeff Goldman, and today I'm going to reveal a story that's been buried in classified archives for over 70 years. Picture this. It's April 1945. American soldiers are pushing through Germany when they discover something extraordinary in an Austrian salt mine. Inside this underground cavern, they find 6,700 paintings, including works by Michelangelo and Vermeer. The soldiers who made this discovery weren't typical infantry. They were art historians, museum curators, and conservators wearing military uniforms. They called themselves the Monuments Men. But here's what Hollywood didn't tell you about that famous discovery. Just 50 miles away, another group was making their own discoveries. Soviet troops, also searching for hidden art, but with very different intentions. While the Americans were documenting and protecting, the Soviets were loading trucks. Massive convoys of trucks heading east, carrying not just individual paintings, but the entire contents of museums. The Monuments Men story you think you know? It's only half the truth. The real story involves a systematic, state-sponsored operation that dwarfed anything the Nazis ever attempted. An operation so secretive that the full extent only came to light when Soviet archives opened in 1991, revealing shipping manifests that documented the largest art theft in human history. Let me take you back to where this secret war really began. December 1942, Washington, D.C. A group of American museum directors walked into a meeting with President Roosevelt. They weren't there to discuss troop movements or battle strategies. They were there because they understood something that most military leaders didn't. Wars don't just destroy lives and cities. They destroy the accumulated culture of entire civilizations. These museum directors had been watching in horror as reports filtered back from Europe. The Nazis weren't just looting art for personal gain. They were systematically erasing the cultural identity of conquered peoples. Jewish collections were being destroyed or shipped to Germany. Ancient churches were being converted into ammunition depots. Irreplaceable manuscripts were being used as kindling. Dr. Paul Sachs from Harvard's Fogg Museum stood up in that meeting and said something that would change the course of cultural history. We have a responsibility that goes beyond winning this war. We have a responsibility to preserve what makes us human. Roosevelt listened, and on June 23, 1943, he signed the order that created the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program. But here's what's crucial to understand about the Monuments Men. They weren't just American do-gooders trying to save pretty paintings. They were fighting a philosophical war about what victory actually means. The Nazi ideology claimed that culture belonged to the superior race, that conquest gave them the right to take everything from the conquered. The Monuments Men represented a different idea, that cultural heritage belongs to all humanity, and that protecting it was part of protecting civilization itself. The first monuments officers arrived in Europe in June 1944, right after D-Day. Picture these guys, professors from Harvard and Yale, museum directors from major American institutions, suddenly finding themselves in combat boots, trying to navigate active war zones with maps marked not with military targets, but with the locations of Romanesque churches and Renaissance palaces. Captain Walker Hancock, a sculptor from Massachusetts, wrote in his diary, "Today I prevented the demolition of a 12th century cathedral to make way for a supply depot. Tomorrow I'm supposed to locate and secure Goring's private art collection. Sometimes I wonder if they gave us the right training for this job. They hadn't. Nothing could have prepared them for what they were about to discover." The Monuments Men quickly realized they weren't just dealing with Nazi looting. They were uncovering an industrial-scale operation that had been going on for years. Hitler and his top officials had created detailed lists of every major artwork in Europe. They had teams of art historians working full-time to identify and catalog everything worth stealing. When they conquered a country, they didn't just take the obvious treasures. They stripped entire museums, private collections, even church altars. But the Americans had advantages the Nazis didn't expect. First, they had genuine expertise. These weren't opportunistic thieves. They were people who had spent their lives studying and protecting art. Second, they had the cooperation of local populations who were desperate to save their cultural heritage. And third, they had something the Nazis never understood, a mission that went beyond acquisition. Captain James Rohrimer, who later became director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, explained their philosophy: "We're not here to take. We're here to return. Every piece we find goes back to its rightful owner, whether that's a museum, a private collector, or a country. Our job is to undo the damage, not to benefit from it." This philosophy would be tested in ways they never imagined. Because as the Monuments Men were discovering hidden Nazi caches, they started noticing something disturbing. Sites they had marked on their maps as secured were turning up empty. Paintings they had documented were disappearing. At first, they thought it was residual Nazi activity, maybe SS officers trying to save some final treasures for a post-war revival. Then they started hearing stories from local civilians. Stories about Soviet soldiers with very specific shopping lists. Stories about convoys of trucks heading east, loaded with crated artworks. Stories about entire museum collections being methodically packed and shipped, not by retreating Germans, but by advancing Soviets. Lieutenant George Stout, one of the founding members of the Monuments Men, wrote in a classified report, "We are not the only ones hunting for art. There appears to be a parallel operation with objectives that may not align with ours." That report, filed in August 1944, was the first official acknowledgement of what would become the greatest cultural theft in human history. The Americans didn't know it yet, but Stalin had been planning his own cultural war since 1943. While Roosevelt was approving the creation of the Monuments Men, Stalin was secretly authorizing something completely different: systematic acquisition of European cultural treasures as war reparations, not just for restitution, but for permanent acquisition by the Soviet state. The scale of what Stalin was planning would have shocked even the Monuments Men. We're not talking about opportunistic looting by individual soldiers. We're talking about organized military units with specific missions, detailed inventories, and direct orders from the highest levels of Soviet leadership. Units that would eventually be known by a name that still sends chills through the art world: Trophy Brigades. Here's what makes this story so incredible. Both sides were often heading to the same locations, following the same intelligence, racing to reach the same hidden caches. American scholars and Soviet acquisition teams, sometimes arriving at the same castle or salt mine within days of each other. Two completely different philosophies of cultural preservation playing out in real time across war-torn Europe. The Monuments Men thought they were in a race against time to save European art from Nazi destruction. They had no idea they were also in a race against Stalin's Trophy Brigades, who were conducting the most systematic art acquisition program in human history. A program so successful and so secretive that its full scope wouldn't be revealed for almost 50 years. But here's the thing that kept me up at night when I first discovered this story. The Trophy Brigades weren't just more successful than the Monuments Men. They were more thorough, more organized, and they had something the Americans didn't have: unlimited time and no obligation to return anything they found. In our next episode, I'm going to reveal exactly how Stalin's Trophy Brigades operated, the staggering scale of what they accomplished, and why the complete contents of Berlin's Pergamon Museum ended up in Moscow. We'll see shipping manifests that document individual items, meet the Soviet officers who led these operations, and discover why this massive cultural theft remained secret for decades. Because the truth is, while the world was celebrating the Monuments Men's discoveries, Stalin's Trophy Brigades were quietly shipping over 2.5 million artworks to the Soviet Union. And many of those masterpieces are still there today, hidden in Kremlin basements, while families around the world fight legal battles, just to prove their property was stolen.